What would you do if you came home one day and found your yard completely destroyed, every tree cut down, the landscape you loved turned into a barren wasteland, all without your permission? Would you scream? Would you demand answers? Or would you do something far worse to the people responsible? For a long time, I had ignored the HOA in my neighborhood. Not because I didn't know what kind of petty tyrants they were, I did. I had seen the way they nitpicked over mailbox colors, fined people for having flower beds that didn't match their so-called community standards, and bullied homeowners into following absurd rules that no one had actually agreed to. But I never let it bother me because, unlike the other residents, I had never signed any contract binding me to their authority. My house was not under their jurisdiction, and I had made that clear from day one. I paid cash for my property, never needing HOA approval for anything, and as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. But people like Karen, the HOA president, don't know how to leave things alone. She thrived on control, on dictating how the neighborhood should look, and on making people bend to her will. And when someone refused to comply, that only made her more determined to break them. First, it was polite letters, friendly suggestions that my trees didn't align with the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Then, they became formal notices, warnings about violations I never agreed to, fees I had no obligation to pay. I threw every single one in the trash. The trees on my property were old, well-maintained, and part of the landscape long before Karen and her HOA dictatorship took over. Then one evening, I pulled into my driveway and felt my stomach drop. Something was wrong. I could smell it before I even stepped out of my car, freshly cut wood, sawdust still hanging in the air. My yard, once lush and private, was gone. Every single tree, gone. My property, the sanctuary I had built, had been turned into a barren, lifeless lot. And standing there, waiting for me with a smug, self-satisfied grin, was Karen. I stepped out of my car, my hands tightening into fists at my sides as I took in the absolute destruction before me. My yard, once shaded by the towering oaks and thick evergreens that had stood there for decades, was nothing but a wasteland of jagged stumps, scattered wood chips, and the sickening scent of fresh sawdust. The ground was torn up where the roots had been ripped out, as if a tornado had swept through, stripping away not just the trees, but every last bit of privacy, every piece of history that had made this land my home. A sharp, bitter rage surged through me, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to take a steadying breath. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. Someone had ordered this, and I already knew exactly who. Standing near the curb, arms folded and a satisfied smirk on her face, was Karen. She was dressed in her usual pristine blouse and iron slacks, the very image of an overconfident bureaucrat who had never faced a consequence in her life. Behind her, an HOA-branded truck was parked like a war trophy, its tires still caked in dirt from my yard. "Oh, good. You're home," she said, her voice dripping with fake cheerfulness, as if we were just neighbors making small talk and not standing in the middle of a crime scene. We had to take care of those trees, they weren't up to HOA standards. My blood ran cold at the casual way she said it, like she had just adjusted a garden bed, not invaded private property and destroyed something irreplaceable. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, watching her closely, reading her body language. Karen was expecting a reaction. She wanted me to lose it, to yell, to threaten, to give her a reason to paint me as the unreasonable one. The way she stood, hands folded, chin raised just slightly, told me she was prepared to lecture me about the rules, to tell me this was all perfectly within her authority. I met her gaze and smiled instead. "I see," I said slowly. "So you're telling me that you came onto my property, without permission, and cut down my trees because you decided they weren't in compliance?" She blinked, clearly not expecting my calm tone. A small flicker of hesitation passed through her expression, but she recovered quickly, adjusting her posture with forced confidence. "Not quite," she said, her voice smooth but just a little too tight. "The HOA has full authority over the aesthetics of the neighborhood, and your trees were, well, let's just say they didn't fit the community standard. We made the necessary adjustments to maintain harmony." Harmony. That word. The favorite excuse of power-hungry people who want to control everything around them. I nodded slightly, as if considering her words. "Good," I said evenly. "Then you won't mind if I take this to court." Karen's smugness vanished instantly. It was like watching the air deflate from a balloon. She blinked, her lips parting slightly, then let out a short, nervous laugh. "Court?" she repeated, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "There's no need to take it that far. This was simply an administrative decision made by the HOA, well within our rights." I took a single step forward, lowering my voice just enough that she would have to focus to hear me clearly. "I'm a federal judge, Karen." She froze. Her breath hitched. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. That was the moment she realized how deeply she had screwed up. The color drained slightly from her face as the full weight of what she had done finally settled in. Trespassing. Destruction of private property. Unauthorized removal of valuable assets. This wasn't just an overreach of HOA power. This wasn't just a violation of a community guideline. This was a crime. I didn't wait for her to respond. I simply turned and walked past her, stepping over the butchered remains of my trees, the ruins of what had once been my sanctuary. I already knew exactly what was going to happen next. Because I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to bury her. I stepped into my house, my jaw tight, my hands steady, but my mind already racing ahead. I had dealt with arrogant, power-hungry people like Karen before, people who thought that authority, no matter how small, gave them the right to trample over others. The problem with people like that was simple: they never knew when to stop. She thought she had won. She thought she could invade my property, destroy what was mine, and walk away unchallenged. But she had made a mistake. She had come after the wrong person. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and accessed my home security system. My property had been under 24-hour surveillance since the day I moved in, not because I feared crime, but because I always believed in covering my bases. I pulled up the footage and felt a slow, dark satisfaction creep into my chest. The entire event had been caught on camera, every single moment. The videos showed Karen standing on my property, giving directions to the workers like a queen overseeing her subjects. The crew had moved in quickly, chainsaws roaring to life as they butchered my trees one by one. I watched as they hauled away the wood, loaded it into trucks, and drove off. I hit pause, narrowing my eyes. Something felt off. I rewound, watching the footage again. This time, I paid closer attention to the logos on the trucks. They didn't belong to a standard landscaping company. In fact, they didn't belong to any registered HOA service provider I had seen before. I started digging. It didn't take long before I found the first crack in Karen's story. The company that had removed my trees wasn't a landscaping business at all. It was a private timber company. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about community harmony. Karen hadn't just cut down my trees. She had sold them. I scanned through county records, tracking recent timber sales and logging permits. Sure enough, I found a freshly processed sale order for high-quality lumber, oak, maple, and cedar. The buyer? A private firm specializing in high-end wood exports. And the seller? The company Karen had hired. I checked financial records next. My legal access to public databases made the process quick. And when I saw the money trail, I knew exactly what had happened. Karen hadn't just violated my rights. She had personally profited from the destruction of my property. The HOA had never approved this job, This was a backdoor deal she had orchestrated for personal gain. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about my trees anymore. It was about corruption. And I wasn't even close to done. I turned my attention to the HOA's financial records. I had already heard the complaints from neighbors, fees increasing every year, but no real improvements. Roads were cracking, the community pool had been out of service for months, and the playground had broken equipment that no one ever seemed to fix. But somehow, the HOA was always claiming to be short on funds. I had access to public financial disclosures as a judge, so I started pulling spending reports and transaction histories. And that's when I found the second crack in Karen's empire. Money was missing. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled into personal accounts, disguised as vendor payments. Some transactions were outright fake, services that had never been performed, invoices that led nowhere. And every single one of them had been signed off by Karen. I felt a dark, cold satisfaction settle over me. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she could manipulate homeowners, embezzle their money, and destroy private property without consequences. She thought she could get away with it all. But I had just found the evidence that would ruin her. Still, I wasn't ready to strike just yet. I wanted to see what Karen's next move would be. I wanted to see if she still believed she was in control. And most of all, I wanted to give her just enough rope to hang herself. I didn't have to wait long to see Karen's next move. 2 days after the massacre of my trees, a formal letter from the HOA arrived in my mailbox, stamped with their usual pretentious seal. I opened it, already expecting a pitiful attempt at justification, but what I read nearly made me laugh out loud. The letter was a festival of excuses and empty corporate nonsense. According to Karen, the trees had been removed because they were a potential safety hazard, a vague, legally flimsy claim designed to cover her tracks. They even had the nerve to add that this was all done for my own benefit, as if I should be thanking them for gutting my yard. But the best part was at the bottom, a warning that if I attempted to plant new trees, would be fined. That was it. They still thought they were in control. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a folder labeled evidence. I wasn't going to waste time responding. I had much bigger plans in motion. But first, I needed the community to see the truth for themselves. That night, I made a few calls. I reached out to the neighbors who had already been quietly grumbling about the HOA for years, the ones who had been hit with ridiculous fines, arbitrary rule changes, and unexplained fee hikes. I invited them over for a casual gathering, just a friendly get-together to discuss some concerns. I wasn't about to walk into this as some lone crusader. I wanted an army. When my neighbors arrived, I didn't start with accusations. I started with facts. I pulled out the financial records I had uncovered, showing where their HOA fees had really been going. Payments to companies that didn't exist. Money disappearing into accounts linked directly to Karen. I showed them the fraudulent transactions, the fake invoices, the blatant embezzlement. The reactions were exactly what I expected. Shock, then anger. That explains why they never have money for road repairs, one neighbor muttered, shaking his head. They raised our fees last year, saying they needed it for community improvements, but nothing ever changed, another added. I let them talk, let the frustration simmer. Then I played my next card, the footage of Karen trespassing on my property, overseeing the illegal destruction of my trees, and selling them for profit. The outrage in the room exploded. She sold them? For money, someone gasped. That's theft. Oh, she is so done. Now that they saw the truth, they weren't just upset about the trees, they were furious about everything. The HOA had been screwing them over for years, and Karen had profited off every single one of them. By the time the night was over, the fire had been lit. The next morning, the first wave of angry residents descended on the HOA office, demanding answers. Karen wasn't there, of course she wasn't. She was nowhere to be found. Instead, her lackeys, the HOA board members who had blindly followed her orders for years, were left scrambling, trying to calm down a mob that had finally woken up. But this was only the beginning. I had already filed formal complaints with the city, the environmental board, and the financial fraud division. Government officials were now involved, quietly gathering evidence, building a case. Karen thought she was just dealing with a few disgruntled homeowners. She had no idea that the walls around her were already crumbling. The HOA called an emergency community meeting a week later, a last-ditch attempt to salvage what little control they had left. It was held in the community center, a cramped room filled with angry residents, many of whom had once been silent but were now demanding answers. The air was thick with tension as Karen finally emerged, looking pale and tired, a far cry from the smug, self-assured woman who had stood on my property and justified the destruction of my yard. She tried to start with damage control, spinning the same tired excuses, miscommunications, administrative oversights, unfortunate misunderstandings. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They cut her off, bombarding her with questions she couldn't answer. Where's the missing money? Why were our fees increasing while nothing got fixed? Who gave you the right to sell private property for profit? The HOA board members, usually so quick to back her up, now sat in stiff silence, clearly distancing themselves from the sinking ship. I let it play out for a while, watching Karen squirm. Then, when the moment was right, I stood up and ended the charade. I placed a stack of documents on the table, hard evidence of fraud, financial misappropriation, and illegal property destruction. I watched as Karen's face drained of color, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Then her phone rang. She answered, and I saw the exact moment she realized this wasn't just an HOA complaint anymore. The government was involved now. The HOA's funds had been frozen, and an official lawsuit was being filed. The walls had finally closed in. Karen lost everything that night. She resigned on the spot, but it wasn't enough to save her. Within weeks, the HOA was dissolved, and the community elected a new board, one that actually worked for the homeowners. Karen, disgraced and humiliated, sold her house and vanished, rumored to have moved across the country to escape the scandal. As for me, I stayed right where I was. Because in the end, I didn't have to shout, didn't have to threaten, didn't have to stoop to her level. I did what I always do best, I let the law do what it was meant to do. And in the place of the trees she destroyed, something far greater grew, justice. But what about you? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or someone like Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.